Hi guys and welcome to Is It Worth It reviews. Today we are talking about Bluesound Node 3rd generation, or sometimes called N130, that was released in 2021. And today we are going to talk about how it works, how it sounds, and how it compares to some of main competitors. To start with the build, it's just decent. This unit is completely made out of plastic, but it feels solid and hefty and it stays nice and secure on top of your shelf. It's not the best, most premium build at this price point that I've ever seen. It's not aluminium or metal or anything, but it feels sturdy and nicely made enough, so just decent build. Next, if we look in the back of the unit, you'll see all the inputs and outputs, and the most important input of these is Ethernet port, meaning that you can connect this one to your home network, which is of course important for a streaming DAC because you want to stream files from your home network or maybe internet streaming services like internet radios, things like Tidal, Qobuz or Spotify if you don't care that much about the sound fidelity, that is. There's also USB input if you want to attach some sort of local storage to it. And then talking about outputs, we have our digital outs in terms of optical output and coaxial output, but we also have analog outs that is RCA single-ended outputs. Oh, and there is also a subwoofer out that I know some of you really appreciate having. There's also a headphone out in front, but as you can see there are no buttons and controls visible on front of the unit. But once you power it on, this whole glossy black middle part on the top of the unit lights up with commands, touchscreen commands that you can play with and do different stuff. But personally I haven't been using it that much because everything is just more convenient to do from the app itself. And yes, talking about the app, Bluesound is actually quite famous for a high quality software. And their app that you use to control this unit and stream and connect natively to many of the streaming services online is quite polished and rich with features. For example, basically anything that I can imagine in terms of streaming services is supported. Qobuz, Tidal, Amazon Music, Spotify of course, different internet radios, TuneIn included. And whatever I could imagine, I saw it on the list supported. And personally, I've been using a few internet radios, Tidal and Qobuz, and all of these worked great. Interface is nice and logical, it works fine. Then the functionality is great, ways that you can manage your playlist and the queue of songs that you are listening currently is also rich. For Tidal, one important thing that I liked is that track radio function is supported, so when I hear a song, I like it, I can immediately go to that track radio, basically listening some similar songs according to the Tidal algorithm. This doesn't work with all apps and all streamers, but it works perfectly fine with BlueOS, and I liked that really. So everything about user interface, its functionality, its polish, its usability is great in my opinion. And that leads us to how does Bluesound Node actually performs. So I'll divide this part into two sections. First, I'm going to talk about its digital outputs if you're using it only as a digital platform feeding your external DAC. Why would you do that? Well, if you already have a really good standalone DAC, that is better than the internal one on a node, but you just need a streaming platform, and that's when you use digital outs. So I connected Node to several of my DACs using coaxial SPDIF output because I prefer it to the optical one. In my experience it usually sounds better, and I was quite happy with the sound. Node does not have any obvious shortcomings. It doesn't color the sound in any obvious way, like adding excessive warmth or excessive high frequencies making sound too bright or sharp. analytical or anything like that. It's just a nicely balanced, resolving sound with enough detail retrieval. I noticed something coming from better digital streamers, that the soundstage depth is not all that impressive. Now, soundstage is decent, width especially, and tones in it are well separated, they're not clogged or congested or anything, but when it comes to the depth, like the feeling that there's deep soundstage behind your speakers, Node is not doing that much of that. It's more of like flatter kind of presentation. And to see if I'm imagining it, I quickly started comparing Node to several other streamers. First of all, I've started with these three. And I'll do a comparison with these three streamers at once, because all three of them sound virtually the same, with some small, tiny, fine differences. So first of all is Pi2 Design Pi2 AES, which is like a Raspberry Pi hat. It's kinda do-it-yourself solution, but it's really affordable and sounds great. The second one is Pi2 Design Mercury, which is ready to go the moment you purchase it, with casing and everything, but it's more expensive. And the third one is hifi Zen Stream, which is a great value streamer. I did review on all three of these if you're interested in a more in-depth review. But when you compare any of these three directly to Node, I think that Node is not exactly their equal. Any of these streamers sound a little bit more incisive, clear and crisp, and with better sound staging. It's especially that depth part. Now, width is quite similar, but the sensation of depth and like dark background with instruments and vocals just coming out of that background and arranging themselves in very three-dimensional image is better with any of these streamers than it is on Node. Detail retrieval again is slightly better with these streamers, and everything is slightly crisper and cleaner and more precise and separated with like greater skill. It's not that Node sounds bad when you listen to it on its own. It sounds pretty decent, pretty good, but in a direct comparison, it cannot fully match the resolution, detail retrieval, and sound staging of these three streamers. Admittedly, Bluesound Node is much more user-friendly than any of these, because its software support, software platform, is more mature. Everything works as you would expect. It never has any sort of glitch or bug. You do not have to tinker with OS and software yourself like you have to do with these Raspberry Pi based streamers. And it doesn't have any sort of weird behaviors like hifi Zen has, for example. And also, streaming service support out of the box is definitely the best with BlueOS, because everything you could ever imagine is supported natively. You do not have to jump through hoops or use third-party software to make any service you're using work with BlueOS, and that's great. But sonic-wise, yeah, Node is not the best sounding streamer in this group. My next comparison was with recently reviewed Eversolo DMP-A6 streamer that is some 30% more expensive. That's like $2 to $250 US. It's not insignificant, but it also doesn't feel that big of a difference once you realize that the build quality and overall looks and feel of Eversolo is, it feels like a higher tier, or maybe even 2 tiers higher product. And that goes for their sound differences too. If you viewed that whole review dedicated to Eversolo DMP-A6, you already know that it sounds really great. It's just cleaner, with deeper, darker background. Tones are coming from that darkness, better separated and pinpointed with greater skill in their places, having more empty room around them. And then the sound stage is slightly wider, it's noticeably deeper, and tonality feels slightly fuller and lusher. So when you compare digital outputs of Eversolo DMP-A6 and Bluesound Node, it's very noticeable that Eversolo has sonic performance that's at least one tier above Bluesound Node, but maybe even more than that. So it's really no competition there. And when it comes to software, once again, BlueOS is more versatile, it has better streaming service support, and anything you can imagine you can do with it. But on the other hand, Eversolo is no slouch either on that part. It has pretty decent app and support, and you can even use local SSD filled with music. But if you're really focused on these online streaming services, there is definitely a better chance that BlueOS supports the streaming service that you personally prefer, no matter what it is, whereas Eversolo is focused more on these few very popular services. But as for the sound fidelity, Eversolo is a clear winner, and that's just that. And finally, moving to the analog outputs, talking about the integrated DAC, digital to analog converter inside of the Bluesound Node. If you decide to use it as all-in-one device, both digital streaming platform and DAC, all of the qualities that I mentioned for the digital platform itself still stand for the analog outs. Now the tonality is fairly neutral, sound is well balanced, the detail retrieval is decent, sound staging is decent, especially when it comes to width, not so much when it comes to depth. So I won't repeat everything because in isolation, I can simply repeat everything that I said for digital outputs. So I immediately moved on to few comparisons, of course. I was really interested, recently reviewed this small SMSL SU-1 that was like a small DAC prodigy, and I was amazed how it sounds at $79 US. So I used the digital outputs of Bluesound Node and hooked SMSL SU-1 to act as an external DAC. And oddly enough, the sound was very, very similar to Node's internal DAC. Maybe even technically slightly more accomplished, in terms that notes and their edges were slightly crisper and more precise, but the sound stage was maybe a little bit more narrow, but also kinda a little bit deeper, and in that modest size, everything was maybe pinpointed with slightly greater precision and clarity than Bluesound Node's internal DAC. But roughly speaking, they're on a same level. Node's internal DAC is just a little bit less technically inclined, but has slightly wider soundstage. And again, I consider them to be in the same tier. SMSL SU-1 is not a upgrade in my mind, it's just slightly different sound, maybe slightly technically better sound compared to Bluesound Node's internal DAC. And that sets the line how good this internal DAC actually is. Because SU-1 is such a good DAC for its price, you cannot really beat it until you decide to spend at least $350–400 US for something like topping E70, 70 Velvet, or SMSL SU-9 Pro, for example. Those DACs would be an upgrade, like moving the overall sound fidelity one tier above what's Node's internal DAC capable of. Anything below that, like maybe topping E50 or topping L32, SMSL SU-9, the older one, would mostly be like a side grade to slightly different tonality, slightly different sound, but not an outright upgrade to Node's internal DAC. And then I compared it once again to Eversolo DMP-A6, which is, as I said, more expensive, but when you compared these two side by side using their analog outputs, like whole device working in unity. Eversolo once again sounds noticeably better and like a higher tier DAC/streamer. So once again it sounds just cleaner, more energetic, especially if you can utilize balanced outputs of Eversolo DMP-A6. The Bluesound node does not have balanced outputs. If you can utilize those, the gap will even widen. Eversolo will start sounding even more lively and crisp and clear and energetic with tone edges. And background is just darker, and the whole presentation feels more three-dimensional, more palpable in your room, more real life-like. And once again, in my mind, Eversolo DMP-A6 is noticeably better sounding than Bluesound node, and quite worth that additional cost in my opinion. That actually leads me to the conclusion of this video. Speaking in terms of sound, I'm really not that impressed with how Bluesound node sounds. It doesn't matter if we are speaking about digital outputs or analog outs, it performs okay. I cannot say anything really negative about its sound because it's a really decent sound fidelity. But near that price, you can purchase something that is noticeably better, and that does not make me impressed with this device. But what did really impress me is how its BlueOS is performing and working. It's fully functional software. It has everything you need to enjoy streaming your music, and it supports basically anything you can think of. No matter what kind of music service you're using, the chances are it's supported on BlueOS. It will work fine. The app itself will work fine. The node streamer will behave nicely. It will not bug, at least in my experience these few days I've been using it. And it's just very polished user experience right out of the box. You do not have to tinker with OSs, third-party software, anything like that. It works great, it's polished, and it sounds quite decent. And if you're okay with that, I have no problem saying that Node is a pretty decent device. If you have it, if you're happy with it, if you're happy with its sound, there is no need to look for something better because it is a decent device. But if you're currently on the market and if you want the most sound fidelity for your money, I would suggest looking at my Eversolo DMP-A6 review. It is more expensive, but in my opinion, performance gap between Node and DMP-A6 is much bigger than the price gap is. And in my mind, that makes it a much better value, better performance per your dollar. That would end today's video. Now, if you liked it, click that button, comment down below, subscribe, consider becoming a patron. And by the way, thanks to my patron Vlada, who actually loaned me this one for a review. See you next time, guys. Bye.